really want to welcome you on behalf of the Hungarian Nuclear Society. It's a pleasure and it's an honor to have you here in Hungary. And, we know that you have a really tight schedule program, 102 days as I know. So you are meeting all the, as I've seen the program, you meeting with all the important persons regarding to nuclear industry in Hungary. So it is an honor to be one on the list in that regard, I mean. So I'm sure you know that we are a very interesting, exciting period before this period, as we are having these two new units at Paks to be built. I guess, or assume that your visit is in some way connection to this thing. And I'm sure that if I'm looking for the Hungarian nuclear industry, that we have, of course, some sources, which is, I would say, has some limits. So we really need to, let's cooperate, involve everyone in Hungary who could be involved in this project. And as well, I mean, we also need some kind of help from abroad as well, from the other companies and international organizations as well, from the OECD, NIA as well, I think. So it is really an honor to get this information, how the NIA could help us. And also an honor to get this information directly from the Director General from this organization. So I would say, again, just thank you very much to visiting us, and I'm just giving you the floor to give your presentation. Okay.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. It's after lunch. I'm afraid people might fall asleep. Well, first, as you probably may have heard this by now, but this is my very first trip to Hungary. I've been trying to get to Hungary for quite some time, so it was a pleasure to finally come. I'm sorry it's such a short trip. It's only going to be 2 days. But it's sandwiched in between a trip to China, which we just returned from, and a trip to Argentina, which we'll be going to this weekend. So in between is Hungary. One of the things that obviously, as you just mentioned, that made the timing for this interesting was the fact that you're in the middle of this discussion about building a nuclear power plant. And this has become a bit of a rarity in NEA countries to talk about building new plants at this point in time, because it's a very stressful time in the nuclear industry, and I want to talk about that a bit. But to start, I think what I'll do is begin by just giving you a little bit of a broad overview of the NEA. I suspect that many of you have interacted with the IAEA probably more than the NEA, so I wanted to give you a bit more background. We are obviously a much smaller organization than the IAEA. We don't have the global membership. We are a much more focused membership, 33 countries. And in large respect, the countries of the NEA are the countries that have the deepest background and experience in nuclear technology, nuclear regulation, nuclear science, and other areas. And the point of the NEA is to bring those countries together to solve difficult problems. We just have all the flags up here. I note that the most recent members to join the NEA are Argentina and Romania, which became members of the NEA just last year. China and India are not members of the NEA, but we have good relationships with both. And as, in fact, our relationship with China is growing quite substantially. Who knows what the future holds, but our work with them has been expanding a great deal. We incorporate not just the work within the agency itself, but we have a lot of separately funded activities, which I'll show you again in a moment. But also we are the host of the NEA Data Bank, which collects important computer software, computer codes, and nuclear data that's used throughout our membership. So I think some of you might be familiar with that. This just gives you a snapshot of the committee structure that we have. This is the core of the NEA. These committees, which are experts that come from member countries, designated by their country to come to the NEA to work together to discuss a wide range of issues. As you can see, we have a lot of committees. We have 2 committees working on nuclear safety. We have radioactive waste, radiation protection, nuclear science, nuclear technology and economics here. And this is also the management board for the data bank. So we have people that come together usually once or twice a year to participate in discussions. But each one of these committees is really an organization unto itself. And just to pick an example, the Nuclear Science Committee, as you can see here, has 25 to 30 experts on it, but under the Nuclear Science Committee is an infrastructure of expert groups and working groups on a wide range of issues. You can see here, this shows you the expert group on economic management, benchmarking of experimental data, accident-tolerant fuels, and the Nuclear Science Group also has some research projects underway, particularly this project on thermodynamics of advanced fuels. And all of the work of these committees, and this is true for nuclear science as well as the others, is usually represented in a series of reports that comes out on a continuous basis. So if you go to the NEA website, you'll see there's thousands and thousands of reports that have been generated over the years that cover a wide range of specific topics, and all of those are available for free download. So anytime you want to go to the website and download reports, feel free to do so. As I mentioned, we do have separately funded activities. Generation 4 International Forum is a collection of countries that are working together on advanced research to develop next generation nuclear power technology. The multinational design evaluation framework program brings together regulators from around the world to synchronize their assessment of state-of-the-art technology, such as the latest VVDR technology, AP1000, ABWR, are all part of this. The International Framework of Nuclear Energy Cooperation brings together both highly developed countries and developing countries to work on broad issues such as what to do about nuclear waste and how to finance nuclear power plants. Hungary is a member of both MDEP and IFNEC, and particularly I think MDEP is an area where Hungary has been very active. There is a VVER working group where STUK and Russia and India are all working together to look at, assess the latest version of the VVER technology. We're also the home for these joint projects. And this is a very important aspect of the work of the NEA because unlike most international organizations, our framework enables us to launch joint projects in a very, very quick fashion. We can bring together multiple players to work on any subject that countries would like to approach. And after the creation of a very brief document, we can launch and do research together. So it doesn't require a lot of international negotiation as you do normally have to do in the multinational context because we already have that framework. So this is something we do quite often. We're actually expanding this, looking at some projects which I'll talk about as we go forward. But as you can see, the projects cover a wide range of areas. And Hungary participates in several projects, including the Halden Reactor Project, the Lhasa Force Coolant Project, and several others. I note that the Studsvik Cladding Integrity Project is going to be meeting here in Budapest in May, so some of you might be participating in that. So this is an area where we are able to work not just with our member countries, but also with others. China is members of several of these working groups. India is on a few. So we're able to work with a broad range of countries, and we have a lot of flexibility with this. I wanted to sort of highlight two such projects that are ongoing right now. BSAF is a benchmark study on the accident of Fukushima. This is a very interesting research project that countries have come together to work on. What this project does is it looks at all the severe accident codes in our member countries and runs the Fukushima scenario with the severe accident codes. And then to see whether the codes agree with each other first. And you'll be happy to know that there is a lot of agreement. There are some differences, but there's a lot of agreement. And then to look at how the codes compare to the actual experience of Fukushima. And again, there's very good agreement. So we built a lot of confidence with that. So we launched a second phase of BSAF to try to project the scenario of Fukushima out further in order to try to estimate where the core debris may have deposited within the reactors. So that's a very important project. And SARAF is another project related to Fukushima Daiichi that's focused on getting water samples from the plant itself and doing some chemical analysis in order to try to anticipate what the core debris might be composed of. So these are two important research projects that we're engaged in right now. And I highlight those obviously because I want to spend a few minutes talking about the Fukushima Daiichi experience. It's hard to believe that it's now been almost 7 years since the accident. The time has gone by very quickly for those of us who've been in the middle of this. I think it's now a good time to sort of take a step back and to think about what the accident really meant to the future. Again, I'll talk about that a little bit as we go forward. But obviously, if you're in the regulatory community in particular or the operations community, Fukushima has had a very, very large impact. And I think that when we look at this, there's a lot of people around the world that might think that the accident told us something substantive about nuclear power that we didn't understand. Either the nuclear power plants weren't safe or we weren't regulating them well. And our member countries came together soon after the accident and wrote this report on the Fukushima accident. And they came to a very clear conclusion very quickly. And all the countries, including countries that later decided to step away from nuclear power like Germany, concluded that the reactors are safe. That Fukushima was a very unusual set of circumstances. There were some very specific circumstances related to that site. But there's also the recognition that not all nuclear power plants are going to be exposed to massive tsunamis. And so we don't think there's anything that came out of this experience that told us that nuclear power plants were safe or we weren't regulating correctly. However, if you're working in the nuclear field, you know that you have to learn from experience. And the experience of having a severe event, like a large tsunami or a massive earthquake, is something that we need to think about. And so that was something that had to be incorporated into our thinking about nuclear regulation, to be prepared for extreme events. We also found, and this is something that was something of a sensitive issue for quite some time after the accident, because particularly when I was at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, we didn't want to be in a position of sounding like we were criticizing the Japanese. It wasn't our business to tell the world that the Japanese made mistakes. We wanted the Japanese to say the Japanese made mistakes. And eventually, reports came out, and as I think all of you are aware, that very soundly criticized how Japan created a culture within the regulatory community and the operations community that did not take full account of the potential for nuclear accidents and really weren't prepared. And when we looked at this, we saw that there were very clear indications that there were human failings in this process, both on the regulatory side and on the operations side. And so the fact that there's a human element that has to be accounted for is something that we take very seriously in the NEA, and we spend a lot of time working on that. So I always like to boil the accident down to what I call the big lessons that were learned. Obviously, the most important aspect, if you're going to site a nuclear power plant, you have to understand the physical hazards that that plant will face. It's a very simple, well-understood principle, but I think that until the accident in Japan, it never quite came home. We never really saw it lead to a problem. We always knew that flooding, earthquakes, other things could compromise the plant. We saw it happen in Fukushima, so this has been reinforced. And around the world, we've seen people go back and look at their assessments and refine their assessments. Also recognizing extreme events can happen. We can't build any facility to withstand any possible event, but you can't. We tend to ignore the once in a 100,000-year event, but the truth is the once in a 100,000-year event could happen next week. And so the lesson of Fukushima really is, and this is probably the most important aspect from our standpoint, is we have to give plants the ability to respond to the unexpected. If there is a severe event at a plant, how do we respond? How do we enable the plant staff to be able to rescue the situation, to prevent a severe accident from taking place? And that's really, I think, one of the most important things that came out of it. And as I mentioned, these human aspects of nuclear safety are going to be very important. So we looked at these over the last several years, and we wrote a report that came out at the 5-year mark, where we assessed what countries had actually done in the aftermath of the accident. And it's very gratifying to see that regulators and operators all around the world came to essentially the same conclusions about the accident, about what needed to happen. And so they've all gone about to reassess their natural hazards. They've all gone to look at how do we reinforce against flooding. They've all gone back to look at how do we provide for emergency cooling in case we lose all on-site and off-site power. So these sorts of things have all been done all over the world. It's been a very consistent message. They're organized different ways, they're called different things, there's slightly different approaches in different countries, but the basic story is really very, very similar across the world. And so I think we've all come to very similar conclusions, and this report documents that quite effectively. So, you know, I look back now at the accident. I went to Fukushima soon after the accident took place. Not that soon, it was several months. But it was still very much of a crisis situation. And I remember when I went to the site, you know, the drive to the site from the staging area actually left a bigger impression on me than the visit to the site itself, because I remember we were traveling through these very attractive parts of Japan, all these, you know, attractive neighborhoods with car dealerships and restaurants, and the people were gone. And if you're a nuclear regulator and you see this, it leaves an impression on you. And really, everyone who went to the site after that, during that time frame, came back with a very sobering feeling. But not feeling that we had to step away from nuclear power, but the feeling that we had to reinforce that there's a personal responsibility that everyone who's involved in this business has to take to their position, and has to bring that seriousness to their work. So it's something that, you know, that certainly has had an impact on many of us, but it's really just reinforced what we already knew, more than teaching us something that we didn't know. Now, with all this happened, I think a lot of people believe that we were going to have to walk away from nuclear power. There were certainly countries like Germany, which made the political decision to shut down their plants. Italy, for example, could have built plants and was thinking about building plants and decided not to do that. But really, when you assess countries around the world, most programs essentially stayed on the same course. Countries that were seriously considering building nuclear power plants really continued to do that. The countries that had programs moved forward. You know, in my country, at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, we had applications in place to build new reactors, AP1000 reactors, and the Fukushima incident happened. We assessed the situation and we approved the construction of the plants. And as a matter of fact, we also authorized the relicensing for 20 additional years of a Mark I BWR reactor, which was the same design that was used at Fukushima, because we felt it was safe. And we assessed it very carefully and concluded there was no reason not to move forward. So that means that nuclear power is still here and still around, and that's very convenient because the world is now trying to come to grips with this issue of climate change. And you're all very familiar with COP21 and the agreement that was reached in 2015 in Paris. But one of the things that I find as I talk to people about this that gets lost, and is really quite interesting, is that for some reason, people tend not to talk about energy as much as you would think. But energy is really the whole story. Energy is 60% of the story, at least. And so if we're really going to be successful in dealing with climate change, it is really a question of how do we use and produce energy in the future. And it really boils down to that. The rest of it is almost peripheral to what we do on the energy side. So many countries, particularly China and India, have already announced that their intent is to build more nuclear power plants as part of this. But we don't expect that all countries will do this. There are a lot of countries that are focusing on renewables, obviously, but nuclear power does seem to have a role to play here. This is an interesting chart that we put together based on IEA data, International Energy Agency data. And this chart shows you some of the recent impacts. Unfortunately, this isn't quite up to date, because I think it will show you some more interesting effects. But you can see, if you look at the U.S., which is the blue line, it's been trending downwards for several years. That's because of switching between coal and natural gas. You see Europe has been trending downward as well for lots of reasons, less industrial activity, more energy efficiency, more use of renewables, just a combination of things. Here is Germany, which is kind of plateaued. The most recent data is actually trending back up. I won't go into that any further. And this is Japan, which I think is an interesting case, which shows you how its emissions have spiked up in the aftermath of the accident as the plants were shut down. Japan has been coming back. We now have 5 reactors back in operation. It's been a slow, painful process in Japan, but they are crawling their way back. But the one that I always find interesting is this. This is France. And why that's particularly interesting is because from looking at the energy infrastructure alone, France today meets the COP21 objectives. Now, if you told people in France that, they would be astonished because they never seem to recognize that nuclear power exists in France anymore. But the truth is that right now France is the only industrialized country that meets those objectives right now, and is the only country that has such a high reliance on nuclear power plants. Now, as France wants to move away from that and move more towards renewables, we expect to see their emissions go up. So it'll be very interesting to see how that plays itself out. We work closely with the International Energy Agency, and this is a chart that they put together as part of a study we worked on together. And the question that they were answering with this is basically, what does the world look like if COP21 is fully successful in 2050? And as you can see in this chart, it's a picture that says we need a little bit of everything. And this is done on a purely economic basis with no policy limitations. And they project that we're going to see massive increases in wind, massive increases in solar, use of carbon sequestration. This chart is also predicated on, I think, a 30% increase in energy efficiency across all sectors. And even with that, you still have this big nuclear component here, and that is equivalent to about 2.5 times global capacity right now. So IEA's projections anticipate that nuclear would have to grow substantially to fill an even larger role. And obviously that's a lot of plants. That's about 500 new nuclear power plants globally. And a lot of that would be in Asia, by the way. Now, if this is going to happen, though, one has to ask the question about the cost competitiveness of nuclear. Now, looking at it from a levelized cost standpoint, nuclear looks pretty good. Nuclear looks very competitive with coal, with natural gas, and it's actually cheaper than onshore wind and solar. So from that standpoint, nuclear looks very good. But increasingly, we are finding that the levelized cost is not a good measure of anything anymore. And that's partially because the markets have changed and, quite frankly, distorted dramatically over the last several years. Market prices don't tell you what they used to tell you. And in most parts of the world, market prices are so low for electricity that there's not enough money being earned to invest in anything that's not being subsidized. So we have to move to a different model, and we've been looking at a system-wide approach. And by the way, we have a major report that will be coming out in the next month or so that will provide some updated analysis on this point. So I thought that in looking at this, rather than looking at levelized costs, which is the traditional way to compare energy resources, something much more pragmatic has to be considered. And we talk about this a lot within the NEA because we argue about this point, actually, about whether you should make these comparisons. But when I talk to people in industry, the fact that nuclear power is so much more expensive from the initial capital investment than other resources is a huge, huge barrier. In Hungary, the PAX program, if it weren't for the fact that the vendor was able to show up with very, very advantageous financing terms, you probably would not have been able to build a plant. And that's the situation that I think many countries are facing, because even if they want to build nuclear power plants, financing those plants is becoming a huge problem because of these very, very high capital costs. And we don't see those costs coming down. We actually see the costs going up, which is not what we expected. I expected by now to see the costs coming down. There's lots of reasons why those costs are going up. Part of it is a lack of practice construction. We don't build plants very often in Western countries, so the teams project managers, the supply chains, they're not really in place. We don't have the experience of building plants on a regular basis, so we're not very good at it, quite frankly. So that's why you see these big hospital runs in France and Finland and the United States. But hopefully this will pay dividends with your project. Russia, China, and Korea build plants quite regularly and are actually quite good at it. Another issue we're looking at is the fact that as renewables come into the grid, it's going to require more and more variable production of electricity from nuclear power plants. This chart shows that if you have a 50% penetration of renewables, that you have to have a pretty sizable ramp rate, both positively and negatively, for the nuclear power plants to fit that model. Now that's assuming you don't find a way to store the renewable electricity. But if you run it the way we do it today, you have to have these kinds of big ramp rates, and doing this cost effectively and safely will be a big challenge. But putting all those things together, this is the analysis that we did a couple of years ago, so this is going to be updated. And we asked the question, so if you assume the renewables can come in any quantity, how does nuclear fare against renewables? And as this chart shows, as renewables have more and more penetration, it basically comes in at the expense of nuclear. Nuclear shrinks as renewables come in. Now, this is a theoretical analysis, because one big question that we have is whether renewables can actually penetrate much more than 30 to 40%. There's real questions about that. Our friends at IEA think they can get up to 75 or 80%. EDF has done a very exhaustive study looking at this. They come up with 40%. So I think there's a great debate about what's actually possible. And I'm afraid that some of that debate is tinged with ideology more than facts, unfortunately. And I think we're just going to have to wait and see what happens over the next 10 years. But this is something that, at least in our analysis, you have to take into consideration. This is driven entirely because of the capital costs. So the challenge that I see before us is, we have this problem with the electricity markets. They're not functioning well. They're not giving us the price signals necessary to make investments in a logical fashion. And we're seeing, because of that, very, very low electricity prices. And in many markets, nuclear plants have become uneconomic and are shutting down. And that's a huge problem for the long-term future. Construction for new plants has not been very good for us because of the factors I mentioned a while back. And on top of that, with everything that's going on, the nuclear industry has always been very conservative anyway. Regulators are very conservative, so having new technologies come in has been very, very difficult. And just at a time where we need to have more innovation, we're not seeing it. So, we need innovation to really solve a lot of problems. We need innovation to make nuclear more cost effective, to enable higher safety at lower cost, to deal with the fuel cycle and nuclear waste, really to fit into this future framework. And that's something that really requires a lot of innovation. But we're not doing the innovation as much as we need to, and that's an issue for us. So that has prompted us at the NEA to launch an initiative called Nuclear Innovation 2050, which is designed to bring countries together to discuss what are the technologies that we really need to focus on. What are the technologies for the next 30 or 50 years? And how do we get those technologies out of the laboratory and into use more quickly? So we've worked with a variety of countries and a variety of experts, and we've identified these as kind of the key technologies to focus on. One that we are that we're looking at right now, we're spending a lot of time, is accident-tolerant fuels. We found that there were a lot of countries that were particularly interested in advanced fuels, and so we've started to focus on that. And we've done we've done one major workshop and a lot of activities since then. And what we're trying to do now is to set a framework for developing and validating advanced fuels in half the time that would normally be required. And so we're trying to work with the regulators, the developers, the industry, the laboratories, all to try to bring all the pieces together to try to find a way to shorten the development cycle. And that's really the whole point of NI 2050, to find ways to get innovation into market much more quickly. And we think the secret of that is to work on a multinational basis to bring the regulators into the conversation. If you know regulators, and I was a regulator, regulators don't want to have the conversation with developers about how to make their lives easier. It's not what we're here for. But because we worry about looking like we're a part of the nuclear village, which is the term the Japanese use. We don't want to be captured and to even have the appearance of being captured by the industry. But if you do it on a multinational basis, it basically makes it much, much easier for regulators to provide that input into the process and to give the input and advice to the industry as to how to go forward. So that's what we're trying to accomplish there. So I've already mentioned some key observations about what the real penetration for renewables is going to be. It's a big question for the future. You know, we talk a lot about carbon, about reducing carbon emissions, but when you look at the size of the issue, talking about reducing CO2 emissions by 80 or 90% by 2050, we're nowhere near on path to do that. And I don't see countries taking the substantive action to do that. The OECD did an economic analysis and said if we actually were to implement COP21 fully, what would the carbon tax look like? And the answer they came up with was between 100 and 120 euros per ton. And no one's talking about numbers like that. So it shows you how difficult this will be. Obviously, the role of energy storage is something that people talk a lot about. I think there's a lot of questions there. And you know, nuclear energy can have a large role in the future, but we think there's going to have to be some adapting. Now, one of the things that we often we're confronted with is the fact that if you look at the people who are working in the nuclear infrastructure around our member countries, it's an aging infrastructure. There's the people who built the plants that are in place today, the people who designed the technologies, they're either retired or retiring, and we have only a trickle of people coming in many countries to replace them, and that's something that has to be dealt with. So another initiative that we have launched is called NEST, the NEA Nuclear Education Skills and Technology Program. Now, this is not designed to solve the problem on a massive basis, but what it is a project where we will provide opportunities for students in multiple countries to work on real issues, real problems, guided by professional scientists at places like PSI, for example, in Switzerland, or Argonne National Laboratory in the United States, places like that. But to have students work together on a multinational basis. So students in Hungary could work with students in the United States, and with students in Japan, and with students in Argentina, and all working on one research project. And that, we think, will excite students to be involved in some of these technologies and to do this on a multidisciplinary basis. So it's not just the nuclear engineers, but also bringing in the chemists and the physicists and materials scientists. So that's something we're focused on. I'll close with just a couple of comments, because I know that stakeholder engagement is something that you're very interested in. And it's another one of those lessons from Fukushima that we had focused on, because we think it's very important that the public be involved in any major decision with nuclear. And I think in Japan it was clear the public was not very involved, and that's definitely changed now. But we find that this is a big issue around the world. So we held a workshop last January, and we brought 140 senior officials together from around member countries and a few non-member countries to just compare notes and talk about, well, what are we doing to engage our publics? And so we had a variety of sessions looking at different aspects, you know, siting nuclear waste sites, building new plants, extending the lives of existing plants, just lots of different issues. And we put these people together in these roundtable dialogue sessions. And this proved to be a really interesting exercise. So you got to have people with completely different backgrounds. You know, people that might be uranium experts sitting down with someone who was an ESPO expert, sitting down with someone who was trying to deploy a new nuclear power plant, and talking about their experiences and engaging with the public. And I think we found it to be a pretty gratifying exercise. We had all these people, regulators were there, developers were there, lawyers were there, and they really had these very intensive conversations, and they came up with some conclusions. So I thought I'd share some of those conclusions with you. Well, one thing is, and I think this is kind of obvious, is there's no magic solution. There's nothing I can tell you about how to engage the public on a generic basis. I think it's a very, very specific issue for each situation. So there's no one size fits all. You know, each country will be different, each situation will be different, but there are some common things. And one thing that I think the group concluded is that the people who are proposing a nuclear-related action, officials in governments, officials in industry, have to be prepared to spend a significant amount of time with public engagement. They have to be able to sit down with the public and have the discussion. And not be afraid of the fact it might take some time. Because what we have found is, and this is something that came out of this conversation quite prominently, that people who tried not to talk to the public very much up front found that they were delayed on the back end as the situation became more complicated and they had to talk to the public. But then it slowed them down when they had a lot of money being spent. So it's much better to talk up front and to spend whatever time is necessary. And we believe that the beginning by just listening to what people are saying, understanding what their concerns are. And I think this is a very, very important aspect of this. It's not just a matter of putting information out, and I think that's a traditional approach. Just put a lot of information out on websites or on releasing papers. It's really a dialogue. It's really sitting down with people and listening to what they're saying. As an example, I was in Japan for an event that engaged with the evacuees from the Fukushima accident. And they had put together a format where select people from the evacuated community were able to ask questions of the experts that were there, both Japanese experts and international experts. And as the dialogue went on, I realized that one of the things that people were concerned about in the community was that it was possible for there to be another earthquake that would cause a problem at the Fukushima plant that would release more radiation and force people to evacuate. And I was amazed by that, because it never occurred to me, because I know the situation. I don't see a situation where another earthquake or tsunami is going to cause a massive nuclear accident at this point. And I talked to the Japanese, and I said, why don't you just tell them that that's not a likely scenario, that they don't have to worry about that? But they were sitting around worrying about that. And that never occurred to me. So this shows you that just talking to people will give you an insight to their concerns that perhaps you can answer. Bringing a young generation into it is very important. Nuclear decisions are generational and by nature. Building a nuclear power plant today, it'll probably be operating 60 or 80 years from now. So it makes sense to bring young people into it. And this is a practice we've done in another part of the agency called the Forum on Stakeholder Confidence, where we work with countries to bring international experts in to sort of build the confidence about what the programs are to dispose of nuclear waste. And Switzerland did this last year with us, and they had high school and college students participate, and that really became a very valuable part of it, because there were a lot of insights about how young people gather information and understand what they're hearing. But at the end of the day, it's important for people to understand that just because you're listening to what stakeholders are saying, it doesn't mean you're doing a poll and taking a vote. That's not what this is about. It's not a democratic process in that respect. It's really information gathering. And just because most people in the room don't like what you're doing doesn't mean you stop. It means you have to understand what their concerns are. Let's see, I think I've talked, I want to emphasize that face-to-face interaction is very important. I've done that myself and found it to be very valuable. And even if you have to spend a lot of time doing it, look at it as an opportunity, not as a burden. We issued this report that provided more detail, again, on our website, on the workshop on stakeholder involvement. And we're planning another workshop next year, which will focus much more on risk communication. So, with that, I will leave you with a nice picture of our building in the suburbs of France. My office is right here. A nice one with a balcony. You can come to my place, have some wine, look at the sun. I advise, however, you wait till spring. It's a little cold out there right now. But if you have any questions, I'd be very happy to answer them. Thank you very much.
ask the question at the end, if it is right.
Right.
Or if you want to ask the question now.
Maybe a couple of questions then.
Yeah, good question.
It's up to you.
Okay, let's start with the question.
Maybe I have one, if you don't mind. So you didn't speak too much about this new innovation, new ideas on the small modular reactors, but it apparently new tendency or a new idea to solve the question how to replace the old plants with, how to say, maybe more economic solution. But the question is on this economic side. So do you think that the SMRs provide a real economic answer to this question, or it's just, how to say, a good idea, but it will die in the near future? So.
Well, maybe. You know, when small modular reactors first started to come up a few years ago, I was extremely skeptical because, you know, I've been through this before. Some of you probably remember the Pebble Bed modular reactor. This is a South African project, got a lot of publicity in the United States, got people very excited. Without spending too much time telling the whole story, I was briefing the President of the United States, President Bush, on a nuclear issue, and somewhere along the way he said, "Whatever happened to that Pebble Bed thing?" And I had to tell him the whole thing had fallen apart. And he sort of said, "Well, that's really disappointing." So that's the Pebble Bed project. So I carry that into this, and so I was very skeptical. And the reason I'm skeptical is because there is this difficulty with small reactors that typically you have to build a lot of them to get the economic, to replace the economy of scale of a large plant. If you're not making a lot of them, then you're probably not going to be economically successful. So I never saw how you get over that hump. Who's going to pay for the first 50 or so reactors at a high price to get the price down? But as I've gone through some of the technologies that are now coming into the market, I spent time talking with some of the vendors, and I spent time looking at how they're approaching it. And I'm now beginning to get excited about a couple of them. Not all of them, but a couple of them. And I do think there is a chance that they can work. And if they work as advertised, I think they could be game changers. Some of the technologies, for example, have such high passive safety characteristics that the regulators are being asked to have an emergency planning zone that stops at the site boundary. That's a whole different world than where we live today. Security costs, operations costs, staffing costs, everything much, much lower in these reactors. So they could really change the whole conversation about nuclear power in the world if they live up to their expectations. So at first so I feel like I can say this is credibility because people knew I was a big skeptic on this when it first happened. But at least on a couple of technologies, I think I'm sold.
Okay, other question? Okay,
My name is Lajos Sadlegy and I'm the WANO representative at the Pakshner. And you mentioned about the challenges and issues related to human, organization, cultural aspects as lessons from the Fukushima accident. The IAEA and WANO have initiated certain projects and improved the attention to these aspects. Does the NEA have ideas or maybe practical actions related to these aspects?
Yes. Well, as a matter of fact, the NEA has an agreement with WANO. And WANO and NEA recently held a very, very unique workshop. And the workshop was held in Sweden at the end of January. And we were looking at something that, quite frankly, the IAEA doesn't like talking about. And what we were looking at was, what are the national cultural aspects of safety culture? How does a national culture affect the nuclear safety culture? And what is the handshake in between the two? For many, many years, people who were experts in safety culture liked to project that safety culture was a global, one-size-fits-all philosophy. And particularly after the accident in Japan, I spent a lot of time in Japan, and I talked to a lot of people, and it became clear that even people in Japan recognized that Japanese culture was affecting safety culture. And that's not to say that there's some cultures are better than others or anything like that. It's just to say it's different. And so the insight that we have had is that there is a need for safety culture in all countries that operate nuclear power plants. There are some principles of safety culture which are universal, but the question is how you get people to behave and train them to behave the way you need them to behave will probably change from culture to culture to culture. How you do that in Sweden will be different from how you do that in Korea. How you do that in Korea will be different from how you do that in Hungary. So we held this culture, we call it the country-specific safety culture forum. We had 50 people from around the Swedish nuclear industry going through exercises and role-playing exercises to identify Swedish culture issues and to identify paths forward to deal with them. And I'll just give you one example of the Swedish culture issue that was very much part of the conversation. And I learned a lot about Swedish culture in this, by the way. And we did this in Swedish, which was a real challenge. But one issue that came up was apparently when Swedes meet in a meeting, it's hard to tell who's in charge because they like to be very egalitarian, and it's almost impolite for someone to assert authority in a meeting. So the meetings have a bad tendency to just kind of wander around and get nothing done. And sometimes people leave the meeting and not even sure what the decision is. So that was a real issue for them. And it's a safety culture issue, because if you bring people together to try to solve a problem and people leave and they don't have a clear understanding of what happened, then what's the answer? So one thing that was recommended was, why not, even if the person who's in charge doesn't have to behave as in charge, but just to go around and check, well, just what did you understand? What are you going to do next? Just kind of go around the room and do that, just as a best practice. Very simple thing. So that's the kind of thing that came out of it. So yes, we are doing things like that, and we have formed a new working group on safety culture that initially is focusing on the safety culture of the regulator, which we think is the first step. But we will also engage in some of the other issues as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me tell you 4 words. The first 2 are electric cars, and the second 2, cryptocurrency mining. What is the position of the NEA to these new challenges?
What was the last one? Currency mining? Well, I don't worry about those things. I recognize that this is, when I first started working, there was a word that people use a lot in the electric business, and it was electrification. And this was something people in the electric business were talking about back in the 1970s and 80s, that the world would move away from using gas and other fuels and moved into almost like an electric-based economy. And maybe now we're getting to that, where we're going to be switching from petroleum to electric vehicles. It seems like that's what most countries want to do. What it means is that the demand for electricity is going to grow geometrically in a short period of time. It depends how fast all this happens. And that makes the reliability of the electric grid even more important. And so that's when issues about, well, how much renewables can penetrate into the market become a real interesting question. So as far as what the uses for electricity are, I don't worry about that. I recognize that the use of electricity will grow over the course of the next several decades, and because of the way that things are happening, I'm afraid in many countries in our membership, they're not going to have the infrastructures to deal with it, and that's going to be interesting. Now, I often think that at the end of the day, the one thing that will not be allowed to happen in any country is for the lights to go off. So the question isn't going to be, will we have electricity? We will have electricity, but will we have the right electricity? Or will we end up burning more coal, burning more gas to make up for the shortfall? And my guess is we're going to burn more coal and burn more gas because we won't have time to do anything else.
Okay, that's all.
That it? Well, thank you very much.
Okay,
Thank
thank you.